Good morning. When we started working on the E syndrome, we had two goals. One, of course, was to understand what Fried was talking about, which seemed to be to us very difficult, which seemed to be extremely important, actual, which had an impact on our past, our present, and our future. There were questions. No, I said there were two questions, two goals. One was to understand E syndrome and to study it. And the other one was this dream we had of building a bridge between the neurosciences and the humanities. And the feeling, the belief that we could not do it unless we were working on a concrete topic. To go on talking about the two cultures was not going to lead us anywhere. What were the questions regarding the E syndrome when we started? And I hope that we are in this round table going to talk about what we have been asked to talk about, but also relating it to the E syndrome. The questions were then, after Breivik had killed about 75 persons, mass murder, whether an individual could be compared to, an individual alone could be compared to an individual working in a group. We didn't know what E syndrome meant in that context. We didn't know whether actually pulling the trigger was the same thing as pressing on a button. We didn't know whether making the decision to kill people and working on the infrastructure of the murders was the same thing as actually perpetrating them. And we had lots of questions about the cultural factors. What the SWAAN was talking about yesterday, it wasn't a perpetrator, an ordinary man, it was an ordinary German man, taking into consideration the cultural influences at that time in history and the context. So when Fried talked about the possible diagnosis of E syndrome, I was extremely skeptical. When you have so many problems of definitions, I mean, we in the humanities, the children of those who mean that you start by defining your terms, it was kind of difficult to begin to take the step towards a diagnosis. A diagnosis on top of it in DSM. DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that is used throughout the world, is a theoretical porridge. It is started on the basis of a psychoanalytic theory and became less and less theoretic, still with the reminiscence of psychoanalysis. It is a very, very difficult, conceptually and practically, methodologically different. What has been introduced now in the last session in the last conference is the RDoc way of studying mental disorders. I thought that your introduction, Fried, was opened an entirely new way of working and working on the E syndrome. So instead of saying, is this a diagnosis? How does it overlap with psychopathy? How does it overlap with the autistic syndrome? Now we are asking, there are many levels from genomes to self-report of looking at this very complex phenomenon. And you presented a grid. And some of those elements that were in the grids, from molecules to cells to circuits to physiology, behavior, self-report, and different paradigms. Thinking of those grids with the different aspects of E syndrome, the different elements, and looking back, I think that in the 3 conferences that we have had, and also in this last one, we are working on making up, creating this element and filling in the gaps. We have many, many gaps. So I hope that we are going to continue. Before this third conference, Itzhak and I were talking about now the future. We are going to change fields. We have had 3 E syndrome conferences. Now we're going to switch to another area. But talking with you people and what happened here, my feeling is that we have to continue, and we have to continue filling in the gaps of the new RDoc way of studying mental disorders. And we need help from you people for us to be able to do it. We, in this extremely luxurious environment, you could think that we are very wealthy. We are not. In order to be able to continue, we need support, mental support, moral support, and economic support. So now I'm going to stop, and I'm going to ask you to, in your interventions, in your summary today of what has happened in your mind, we have learned about our plasticity, so we have changed from the moment we entered this place 2 days ago, 3 days ago to today. Many things have happened in your own way of regarding your area and your research. So while you're talking about that, please relate it to the E syndrome. So what do I do? Who do I give the microphone to?
Well, thank you. This has been very useful for me in a lot of ways. To me, where the neuroscience piece of this really comes into it, I mean, in my work, knowing what the amygdala does is not necessarily going to be extremely useful for me in how I approach looking at extremism. Where neuroscience is really helpful for me is understanding what kinds of concepts are linked in the brain, and so how do the things that happen out in the world produce a response. So, for instance, we in some of the conversations yesterday and some of the talk about mirror neurons and empathy, I can draw some inferences about how propaganda works. When a propagandist is giving a speech and he uses language that suggests to somebody that they're thinking along with him. You use language that says, here, you're making this conclusion from the information I'm giving you, and you say, so here's some information. What do you think about that? Of course you think this, and that can produce a reward sensation in somebody's mind that makes them think, yeah, I did figure that out, and then that makes them more committed to what they're doing. Similarly, when we see that a certain area of the brain fires for uncertainty as for arousal, or if a certain area fires for arousal for aggression, if I know those things are connected, biologically connected, then that helps me understand how it informs behavior. So that, this was really interesting and useful for me on that front to really, start thinking about how certain kinds of reactions to certain kinds of content are physically connected in the brain, and that, when people have those responses, what can we do to encourage a different response or to help immunize them against the kind of extremist propaganda that we see moving out. So I will say on one, excuse me, one thing that, in terms of sort of thinking about E syndrome and why people kill, I think it's very difficult if we assume that there's one reason. So, if we think about, take it out of the context of extremism and think about it as why does somebody decide to get a job in business, or why does somebody decide to join the army? People have a lot of different reasons, a lot of different things will lead them to that. What we can do is try and understand what an organization does to make itself attractive and to capture the widest net of people. So if you're trying to build a political movement, and extremist movements are all political movements, what you want to do, you don't want to attract one kind of person. You want to attract the broadest possible spectrum of people. So it may not be possible to look down at the individual level and say, this is why people join a terrorist group, because the object of the terrorist group is to get as many people as possible. And so they will use a lot of different approaches to do that, and they will get a lot of different kinds of subjects who join them. So.
Thank you. Yes, for me, I would say I was very happy because when I started when I started psychology, I had a shock because I had to choose between clinical and neuropsychology, and I did two. I was doing both neurophysiology and psychology. Only for my PhD, I finally decided to do ethnopsychiatry because, as Gretty said, also the cultural, everything was interesting. Culture, social, the brain, and the intrapsychic, the mental, the life, the psychological life. So for me, all the time, I always had an integrative point of view, an integrative methodology, and I really believe that the complementarism is something very, very important. And so I find myself very at ease, very at home with this zigzag, you say that in English, a zigzag between neuroscience and psychology. And also, to me, it is not at all a problem. On the contrary, I'm also happy to see. For me, it's really something very natural. It's not something. Something difficult to accept, but to see that there is a basis, there is a neural basis on our functioning, and I think it is also a great beginning of something to see, to do like a kind of a cartography, a kind of understand how we function. It's not reductionism, not at all. I didn't understand. I didn't see that there was any reductionist point of view here. On the contrary, because we were also linked with ethics. There is we have all an ethic, and I think it's a shared ethic. So. What can I say? E syndrome. I was really happy to discover because I didn't know your work, Itzhak, before discovering the E syndrome, and I really can say that from all what I learned from the clinical point of view with perpetrator, I really found all the points they match. So I find it really extremely interesting to see. From my point of view, I have nothing to add. I cannot say no, this and this doesn't fit with my experience. So it is really rich, and I think I will talk much maybe later.
Did this change your view on the research you did on your perpetrator? Can you see it in a different frame, or has it changed the way in which you look at it? Would you have approached your interviews in a different way?
No, what it gives me hope. It makes me think of treatment, and also in terms of prevention and treatment. Also, how do you come out of this construction when you became a perpetrator? And I think that all what we heard during these 3 days give me a lot of ideas about how we can do concretely and even better. So my answer would be in psychotherapy, in therapy. And there is not only psychotherapy, there were different ways of deconstructing the construction of a torturer, of somebody who was a perpetrator. So this gives me the idea of maybe many other techniques or methods or different approaches that could be tried and set on to help or to accompany people who were former soldiers or children who were killing, to help them to come out. And maybe also if there is one day medicine, I am not at all reductionist, but if something can help also to prevent or even to treat, after to accompany this de-empathy, dehumanization, because what I see, I see that it is very difficult to come out. Maybe we don't have yet the good technique, the good method, and we are still trying to find the way to help people to come out this mentality after having been a perpetrator. And I think this is extremely important and it will take years to try to the different techniques and methods.
One thing which I found very interesting in your talk, you didn't talk about the lack of empathy, but about the empathy. Empathy essentially it's a process where you shut off. What you say, switch off your heart. There's something there which is not just the lack of empathy. It's an active process for something to be suppressed.
Exactly. Yes. Suppress, and even they had a new vocabulary, and there is a term erase. They erased, the Khmer Rouge erased the people. They erased empathy or the possibility to think what the other could feel when you are doing this and this in torture. So even they had to invent a new word to make it because it was important for them in their system.
I think I learned a lot. I think I'm just reflecting back on the last couple of days and the things that really stood out for me and that were really interesting in some of the themes among the presentations. I can draw back to my own as well too. But a couple of things that stood out and connections that I was able to kind of draw are, I was interested in the notion of values. I don't know if that's quite the right word, which seems to cut across a large number of the presentations. Even the notion of de-empathy, and kind of where is it that you put value? Which group or which persons do you bring value to? And I mean, just thinking about a couple of points from Scott Atron's presentation, from Françoise's as well too. One of the things about Molly Crockett's presentation yesterday that really struck me was the last thing that she spoke about, which was this idea that if you said that it was for a greater good, that you were willing to, in fact, harm people. So I thought that was very interesting. And also to Tanya as well too. I think that this could play into your research on the longitudinal practices of mindfulness and other meditational practices and how they actually changed people. In terms of thinking about the connections with neuroscience, I think that would probably be the best representation that I heard over the last couple of days, where you really looked, and I think one of the things that was impressive to me about it was that you were looking at the same person. You were looking longitudinally, and that you could actually see the way longitudinally that people's brains change, and also too their values change. So that was something that I think one of the connections that I could make. The other thing too, and it's really playing on these realms of meaning as well, it has to do with identity. It's a word that came up in a couple of presentations, but not in everybody's, but it's always there in the background. This notion of both personal but also social identity. And I think that this, I'd be averse to say that it's kind of a categorization, but there is kind of this way in which our own identities are linked to our values. And they're linked to how is it that we might consider other people as being worthy people of our care or worthy of our destruction. So I thought that that was something of a kind of interesting connection to make. And I think that identity and value, I think that they probably do go together as well. One of the points that I've been pondering over the last couple of days is this notion of who do we consider a perpetrator, right? And maybe this came out most clearly in Scott Atron's talk. Would we consider somebody, for instance, who's a revolutionary to have E syndrome, for instance? It depends upon your perspective. Maybe, it is possible that there are similar kinds of individual and even neural experiences that are going on in both revolutionaries and people who are committed to genocide. And it depends upon what your value is, what your perspective is. To connect it back to my talk, and then I can do also to our docs, because I think that that's interesting. The notion of value does connect back to what I was trying to say, which was, if you look at Stengel and you look at his life, look at his individual experience, the culture that he participated in, the things that he was doing were for values, and they were for, they fit into a larger notions of what is good, right? And people are motivated for various reasons to do what they do, and people act for what they consider to be good. This could go back to Swam's point about Germans as well, too. In terms of thinking about what Itzhak presented to us about RDocs, I think it's really interesting. I think from my perspective, I'd want to go up higher levels of analysis as well, too. Self-report seems to be, which was the level that Jessica, Françoise, and I all worked on, or could be construed in that way. But I think that you have to go higher up. I think you have to go higher up into values that groups have, Jam was talking about as well, and onto culture. These are all relevant levels of analysis to consider, and even the presentations that looked only at brain activity, they were also implicated in these kinds of cultural systems of meaning and social systems of meaning. It'd be fascinating to have more conversations about kind of those linkages. Yeah, great, thank you.
I'll start by saying what I've been thinking about E syndrome. We know that people who are more prone to get PTSD, military personnel, are those who get a moral injury. This is what the U.S. military, the Veterans Administration, has been really trying to tease out what makes people more likely to get PTSD. People who either witness or themselves violate laws of war, or maybe even what their mom taught them, that thou shalt not murder civilians. When a soldier murders a civilian or witnesses someone else murdering a civilian, he or she is much more prone to PTSD. I've also read, looking at child soldiers, who thrives and who doesn't. Those who adapt to killing are less prone to getting PTSD. And I'm wondering, is this kind of secondary psychopathy, is that what E syndrome is? I would love to hear how you distinguish between secondary psychopathy and E syndrome. Is it maybe, are we continuing to, I mean, I don't think secondary psychopathy is that well defined. I mean, are you kind of working on defining it? Is it adaptive? If a person finds him or herself in a situation where killing civilians is ordered, or in any case, is it adaptive? That flat affect that you describe, it must be protective. Otherwise, the person is too susceptible to moral injury, which can actually be seen. I also want to say a little bit about Scott Atran's presentation. Scott and I we worked together years ago, and we've been having an argument, I think, for about 15 years, maybe 20 years. We've been having a long-standing argument. And I think that this is not based on the presentation here, but many, many years of talking to terrorists at different levels of organizations. People become terrorists and continue being terrorists because of incentives at many different levels. Sacred values is just one. There's also financial incentives. So there's the spiritual incentive, emotional incentive, finding a clear identity, purposive incentive. It's so reductive to focus only on one of those incentives. If we look at why it is that foreign fighters there's a massive reduction in foreign fighters flowing into Syria, has there been a change in sacred values, or has there been a change in other kinds of incentives? The 5-star jihad is no longer available, but the sacred value is still there. If we look at why it became faddish to join ISIS more than Al-Qaeda, how the two groups were competing, I don't believe it's a distinction between sacred values. I think it's partly emotional incentives, financial incentives that make the difference. So I just wanted to bring that into the room because there wasn't really anybody here to really argue energetically with Scott. So let's see. I guess that's really. No, I would have been very happy to argue with him in person. I was sitting there. At first, I was too excited. Then I raised my hand, but there wasn't time. That's it.
But I think the point that you're raising is, I mean, we cannot really say that the people, from Hamburg, taking, the battalion 101, and all of those, middle-aged firemen or whoever, really had sacred values. But I think there was some ideological framework which gave justification to some extent. So I think it can enter really as a sacred value, which is non-negotiable. I think Scott presented a very extreme example, probably.
No,
it may not be the whole
part of
picture,
it. I think it's part of it. But also, they're part of a group. It's part of an identity, right? People develop a group identity. That's, and interestingly, the networks that he talked about in Europe didn't seem to consistent with the story about sacred values. I mean, we know that of the Germans who have become foreign fighters for ISIS, 2/3 of them are criminals. These are not long-standing sacred values. And half of those from, at least according to the law enforcement personnel, half of those from France and Norway are criminal, and Belgium, they're at least half are criminals. They're not, if they are sacred values, they're developed pretty quickly. They're not deep sacred values. But I'm not denying sacred values. I'm just saying it's a reductive. There's more.
Thank you. Well, I came to this meeting rather unprepared and rather ignorant. Very good way to come to a meeting, by the way. And I looked at it with some of the mental luggage I have, which is as a social scientist, and I thought I am looking at what we call a scientific revolution in its third or fourth phase. Scientific revolutions occur, among others, when people have a new machine to generate privileged data, which they as a group monopolize. Think of echography, for example, and the struggles that engendered. And so this fMRI machine was something new 30 years ago, and it generated data which no outsider could first elicit nor evaluate, and there was this group who had a privileged treasure of very interesting scientific information. And then what happens in revolutions, they expand from their immediate field into new fields. No longer a revolution in one country, but a world revolution, a revolution in the intellectual world. And Itzhak Fried is the Trotsky of the neuroscientific revolution. But he will have a much better fate. But what he did was say, he was one of those who were part of the neuroscientific revolution, who carried these ideas and the relevance of these newly found and mined data into an entirely new terrain. And Itzhak carried it to the field of mass violence, serial crime, revolution, terrorism, and coined the term E-syndrome. I think the question, is there an E-syndrome? I still have my doubts. But I think we are the E-syndrome. We are a number of intellectuals and scholars and scientists who come together on this resounding battle cry. Let's look from the perspective of neuroscience to extreme violent crimes and see what we can do. And then it turns out that it's a very exciting and inspiring concept in all sorts of fields, and that obviously there will be many new territories conquered by this neuroscientific revolution. But now, after 3 of those meetings, of which I attended only a single one, I think it's time to devise strategies for not just explore, inspire, excite, but also actually harvest new, somewhat more palpable, more concrete insights. And that probably means that you have to limit the scope of your questions, to limit the topics you're going to face and to try and discuss. It goes back to science as usual, asking small questions and trying to fit them into a much bigger. But we have suddenly a much larger context. Now, so I sit there rather skeptical, and the first thing I realize is this chasm between the neuroscientific perspective on extremely violent behavior and the historical and sociologists' way of looking is even wider than I thought. But that doesn't mean that it's unbridgeable. By the way, it doesn't need to be bridged at all. It's not necessary that we sort of compromise and make a big treaty that we shall not encroach upon each other's territory. We're, after all, no world powers. We're just scientists trying to understand the world around us. Now, to me, one of the key questions as a sociologist is whether extremely violent people, mostly men, mostly young men, do have some kind of predisposition which they bring to their crimes or to their demeanor, or whether they can be instantly socialized. And the predominating view among social scientists is that, yes, these are ordinary people, by which is meant they have no specific predisposition, they're just your motley crew. And by the act of getting together under strong leadership with strong ideals, they turn into criminals on the spot. I've always found that a little bit hard to believe. But in thinking about it, I came up with one very simple selective criterion. You have to look very closely at how they're selected. If there's a strong aspect of self-selection, of voluntary participation, obviously predispositions must count for more. And if they're simply called up for their number, like Battalion 101 seems to have been, they are more likely a representation of the distribution in the population as a whole. So one must look more closely at the self-selection aspect, and that will. But then it still is very mysterious for sociology. How come that suddenly people who are united in a group become merciless killers, and then when the group disbands, it's usually as if nothing happened? My comment on that would be like Dennis Wrong's expression, it's an over-socialized conception of man. We do not all suddenly conform and then we leave and we act as if nothing happened at all. And even in the famous Milgram experiment, which is the most replicated experiment in the history of psychology, the question, how come that so many people conformed to the expectations of the self-styled experimenter, is left open. And strangely enough, very rarely did they investigate the difference between those people who complied to the end and those who did not. Milgram said that he didn't have the instruments to do so because test psychology is one of the great failed scientific revolutions of the 20th century. There also was a machine to generate data, which nobody else could interpret, but somehow it didn't come through. And you see Milgram saying in 1963, well, I have the F scale, which was made by amateurs, well-meaning amateurs, meaning Theodor Adorno and his crew, and which wasn't very good up to this point. So test psychology could have been one way of figuring this out, but it was shunned by the experimenters in the Milgram school for some reason, which I still think is a pity because we cannot study perpetrators, as I mentioned, at work. But we have some beautiful pseudo-perpetrators, which are the people who in Milgram's experiment conformed completely till the last moment, and then Milgram would ask them, what do you feel about it? How do you mean, what do I feel about it? You told me to do so, so I did. Beautiful. Those are the real baddies, whom you would never meet in reality because either they're in jail or they're dead or they're in hiding or they shut up. But nobody bothered to investigate these people who conformed in the Milgram experiment. So it is still so far an enigma, a black box. Why do so many people, so many meaning so many more than we expected them to, conform to orders, to group pressure, to situational pressures, to kill? And obviously, the E syndrome is a call to arms to say, mobilize all the neuroscientific instruments we have to figure out this question. And I think some very telling and very interesting cues came up. If you permit me, no more than that, cues. But since we are cueless, even some initial cues are very exciting. Let me mention one. We were talking about the impact on mice, not man, on mice of pervitin, amphetamines. And at a certain dose, which is administered, the mice instantly dies, drops dead. But if there are 5 mice, they display all the symptoms you have when you are on an amphetamine high. To a any sociologist who sits dozing in the back of the room should wake up at that moment and say, hey, this is really interesting. Yeah? To me, what was very exciting was the idea that you could train people in empathy for a couple of months, and then not only did they become more empathetic, I could believe that, although it's very quickly, but also that their brain structure visibly changed. This is exciting. Huh?
Thank you. I don't want to interrupt you, but just to say that we have about a quarter of an hour for the rest of the...
I've said what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much. Shall we give the possibility of replying?
Utilization of the microphone? Yes. Okay. Jump in.
I have just a small point which would be appropriate for this particular panel, which is when we do neuroscience, we like to have the correct experimental group. So if we were to try and find out about E syndrome, the obvious thing to do would be to try to get some people with E syndrome into a scanner, something like that, to see what is happening to their brain. And so just as a matter of information, because you've all met sort of terrorists, to what extent would that ever, do you think, be possible?
Yeah, Alain, do you want to come
here? Yeah, no, it's not a comment, but the purpose of the morning, as Gretty MIRDAL reminded, is eventually not only to say what we liked of the meeting, but to see how we can work in the future. And I have the feeling that we have 3 challenges on which I would be happy to have the roundtable feelings. One is to understand what happens, but the second big goal is prevent, and I would say the third goal is cure. So I would be happy to have the opinions of the roundtable participants as to, for the future, what would be the way we could, when we already had some comments concerning understanding, how we could figure out how to go on and continue in these 3 main objectives, which I think have been addressed in the meeting, and sometimes both in similar talks. Understand, prevent, and cure.
I think this was really interesting to hear you, because I was new to this conference and I was constantly like, oh my God, there is a huge gap. I'm a psychologist, neuroscientist, but I also work with sociologists, economists, so I'm a bit used of it, but that was a big gap we had to fill. So I thought what you now are saying is actually, you are working on concepts like identity, sacred value, higher level cultural groups, social identity. That's concepts which we know from psychoanalysis, we know them from group psychology, we know them from economy, but I think neuroscience had not even started tackling them. I think we got so far in neuroscience that we basically have social neuroscience making a little step to bring something like a social reality in the scanner environment, which is another person. And sometimes we say, oh, this is a group. In-group, out-group, that's all. We are not further, so we have, I think, no clue where identities are stored, how they are processed, we know that from psychology, so I think this would really be an example of how we should move into a new field, really, and in thinking like the same thing we had to do in social neuroscience. When I started, it was all about individual, it was about memory, about action, it was perception, and the first paradigm we had to invent to do empathy were completely outrageous, because we had to have a second person in the scanner environment to have a social reality there in a completely non-social environment. So my feeling is the next step, if we would want to bridge that, we would need to make a revolution in bringing culture into the frame, which obviously is even more difficult than bringing another person, but I think there are ways, you know, with virtual realities, there are ways with, and I think we would need to really have a think tank where we think about how we can bring the next level of group identity, group dynamics, identity theory into this level to make a progress. But it would be exciting, I think, but we would need a kind of a think tank days where we really sit together and think about paradigms and to really move forward, because now we are, and it's just like very low level. Exactly.
Yeah. But it's exciting.
So we'll let some people, okay.
Hi. Am I right in thinking, am I right in thinking that Molly has left? So I talked to her after her talk, because when she talked about the charity, people giving money to charity, that immediately made me think about reputation. And I wanted to know if that's what she was talking about. And she said it was what she was talking about. And the studies that she had done before, looking at how other people would judge me, how much blame they would give, she didn't describe it all, but basically they then referred back to the behavior of people, because there's a range of behaviors of people, how willing they are to buy and sell pain, basically. And what she found was that people seem to have a inbuilt idea of what their social group expects of them, and that is what's influencing their behavior. And she even looked at the range of people, the people that were willing to inflict a lot of pain versus the people that were willing to inflict very little pain on other people. And the best fit for the data was an overall fit of the population, not a fit of the people that had the same moral attitudes as them, which she and I thought was a really interesting indicator that so your identity and how you behave in situations is what you expect of the whole group that you're in. And that fits with a lot of things that people have said, because if you're really fused with a group that has a certain morality, which is to kill, for example, then that's the way, those are the values that you use to make your decisions. So I just wanted to add that and clarify that point. And because I think the whole reputation thing, and there's a lot of research in that field, is one that should really feed into what's going on here.
I'm a psychoanalyst, and as being so, I don't meet many perpetrators, because if they would come, it would be different. But what I do meet is children and grandchildren of perpetrators. So maybe this could be a way of knowing more of the trace through the traces of what is left. What left is not the right word, but the traces that occur in the children and the genealogy of these perpetrators. So if somebody is interested, I would more will.
So I'm the only one who's a businessman, I guess. And so I would define myself as a businessman for purposes of this discussion. However, I'm in the social sciences without knowing it, because the sociologists have always helped me cure problems and giving me ideas and suggestions. And all I've been focused on is the cure of violence. So I went into a neighborhood with 625 gang members who controlled the neighborhood. And they controlled it in a very special way, and the people who were there did not like them. So that was my first discovery. They were resentful. So therefore I had to develop an antithesis to what they proposed. And I had to ask them what they wanted. And then what they wanted was to become middle class, because they were all very, very poor. So I said, okay, I'll make you middle class. But if you do that, you'll have to do special things for me. And you'll have to allow me to exploit you. up front. That's what I said to him. I want to exploit you and allow me to make a lot of money here, and I'll do whatever you want. And it was a great motivator and gave us a bridge and a context to work with each other. And I think what is very hard for the social scientists or the psychologists or even the good doctors to see is how does that alleviate the pressure of what I would call terrorism. Well, there was one incident that occurred to me. I wanted to have culture in the area too. Excuse me if I'm slightly long-winded. I wanted to have culture in the area too. So I found out that male ballet dancers were not available anywhere in the United States for ballet companies. So I opened up the largest studio in the city of Los Angeles for ballet. And what do you think happened? Well, I'll give you the result. I mean, I would love to be able to ask the question and hear what you think happened. But what happened was the gangs got so upset, the boys under 20 years old could find a job as a ballet dancer, that they came in and they shot up the studio and they killed one and wounded 4. And the purpose was to get rid of the studio. And of course the dear government, which I despise, made me close it down, saying it was a social threat. It was an experiment that failed to a certain degree, but it was open 18 years. And 7,000 children went, well, I call them children, 7,000 people went through it, which is a very large number. I only wish that there had been a bridge to people like yourselves who could have helped me guide my way through the government trauma that I had to go through when they forced me to close the studio. There's so much potential out there to destroy any movement as long as we try and find what's intrinsic in the movement that the people want to express in a more or less commercial way. And maybe that's been the basis of what I've done. I've been shocked that the only concerts that my community would listen to in the beginning was dissident. They would not allow me to play anything that wasn't dissident. So I know that I've talked too much, so I'm going to hand the thing to the speaker, back to you. But one more thing I want to say is everything you're doing is brilliant. We just have to see you across the line and get down and get your hands dirty. As Sartre said, I think, la main sale.
Well, I mean, I guess it does point out to a fact that there may be smaller groups that we can study, and I think this issue of gang members, I think they do exhibit, in many cases, some of the symptoms that we have described. Let's, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm going to be very brief because I hope that wishful thinking is not making me imagine that I heard Molly say at the beginning of her discussion yesterday that there was one person who refused to participate altogether, to give any shocks whatsoever. And if I'm right on that, I would like to see someone undertake an in-depth study of people like the one who refused.
Okay. Okay, I think we'll hand it back to the speakers here to make some comments. We have about, 7 minutes?
I love the idea of putting perpetrators into the machine, and I'm pretty sure you can get them, provided the IRB will let you do that. The Institutional Review Board you have in the UK, I don't know what it's called there, human subjects. I can guarantee there's one guy I know will do it. If you go to, it's a former terrorist that won't leave me alone. If you go to Denmark, I mean, I think this isn't, the reason I wanted to say this, not to you privately, but to the whole group, is I think if we think collectively about how to get those people into the machine, they're not going to be the ones who are actively fighting, but formers. I think that we can get them to you. Just have to think about how to do it. In Denmark, some of the formers are not in prison. Sometimes you'd have to go into prison.
I just wanted there were a couple of comments about understanding out there, and I just wanted to reflect back that I think just even interest in these questions is the first step. You've got to study them. So Alain, you were talking about understanding, prevention, and what was the last? Cure. You don't get to the last steps without starting the process of studying. Yeah, and you know, the last steps, you just never get there. But also too, just even the idea that there's interest within the scholarly community in thinking through these issues goes a long way. Second of all, the second step would be understanding, and I think that there's still, although there were cues, as Abram said, we're still quite a long way from understanding. The other issues of prevention and cure, I mean, they follow from these. And I think that there needs to be a lot more effort into just understanding what the basic processes are across levels of analysis.
So when we get down to prevention and cure, I think there are certainly things that we can do and learn that will make a difference over time. But I also think that we have to understand, I guess, that these behaviors are part of human history over a very long period of time, and it may simply be that in large groups of people, you will always have something like this. So I was talking to Jessica when we were walking over, I have a rule of radicalization, which I try and use to help people when people want to talk about Islam being particularly dangerous compared to something else. And the rule is about, on average, 15% of any given population are assholes, and about less than 1% are violent assholes. So, and Molly's presentation, I think that lined up. I might have the number approximately right based on the distributions that she was showing in her morality presentation. So when we think about prevention and cure, often where people are talking about how do we make people better, or how do we prevent people from becoming violent, and maybe we should think about how do we prevent people from acting effectively in groups when they are inclined to be violent, because maybe we're always going to have that certain number of people who are going to be bad actors, and so what do we do to stop them from being effective, rather than necessarily to go in and do something that's very hard to quantify, which is to change somebody's heart or brain, unless we can measure their cortical thickness, in which case I'm all for that. But yeah, but I think, you know, I mean, I think it's part of our function as human beings is to reach out to other people and try and be better people and make other people better people, and we all get better together. But our definitions of what better is vary. Our definitions of what's important is vary, and you know, the reason we care about terrorism and extremism and genocide is that they're tremendously disruptive to society. So, you know, you can look at this in the United States and you can often see that, you know, there's a lot of crime that happens in the United States, but it's small crime, so we don't approach it as a whole society problem. We fight it in our communities. We have police to go in and try and break up, you know, armed robbery or domestic violence, but we're not engaged in the same kind of whole society effort that we are engaged against terrorism and extremism. And, you know, I think that, I guess the question is why do we do it differently? And one reason is that terrorism is an attack on the system itself. So the system responds more violently to that. When you attack the government, then the government's going to respond. Whereas if you attack another citizen, the government is less invested in that. But the other reason is that it's these movements and these certain kinds of individuals can kill a lot of people at once. And so, you know, we gravitate towards how do we stop that? And, you know, I guess the question is just how ambitious do we want to be? Are we satisfied if we can stop these groups from acting effectively, or do we need to make everybody into a good person?
If I may, I have always been puzzled by the different questions and expectations that people have to biological, natural science and to humanities and social sciences. Because we deal with human questions that we all know intrinsically since we are human, we think that human science and social science should be able to answer things that you would never ask from medical science. If I now say, this is a congress, a conference, I would like the medical sciences to eradicate illness. What are you talking about? And here you have the same expectations to human and social sciences that we are going to eradicate war, terrorism, and that we should get our hands on it, because if we don't, we're not doing the right thing. This, I think, is the wrong way of approaching what we can do. Right now, we are doing the utmost, I think, even going decidedly outside of our comfort zone by investigating the possibility that there is a syndrome E. Much more than that, doing prevention on the basis of how little we know is morally unacceptable. I'm thinking of autism and how in the beginning of my career, when I was a young psychologist, the theories were that the mothers were cold and unempathic, and we should do family therapy in order to prevent autism. I mean, you can do harm by doing prevention before you know what the whole thing is about. So I am pleading for, please give us the possibility of studying what we are able to study and to draw the conclusions very, very modestly without jumping to things we don't understand.
Well, you know, I definitely agree with you, Gretty, but I really want to focus it and be a little very concrete here in a way, okay? You know, I've made a lot of people angry by saying that I'm looking at something which is like pneumonia, okay? 70% of the people can get it, right? Okay, so the question is, I mean, you can study, obviously, people who get pneumonia every Monday and Thursday and put them in the magnet and maybe find out. Basically, we are dealing with some vulnerability in the human condition in the way that the brain is put together. And we really have to identify those constructs which are meaningful to study. And I think Tanya really said there is a language issue here and conceptual. But for instance, you know, the concept of empathy, although we didn't fully agree on that, but that concept we agree may be a useful one. Dehumanization, you know, is, although it's a social concept, it's still a useful one. The concept of agency. And now, you know, we have those new concepts of identity and the concept of sacred values, which we really do not understand. So I think you guys can really help us, in a sense, try to define it, and then we can move that concept into Tanya's MRI. Okay, we can put that concept in the MRI, okay, and now we can actually study it. But I think it's like, you know, we're basically talking about studying the immune system. How can we bolster the immune system, which will prevent those things which are happening too often? So, for instance, what Tanya is doing, you know, trying to maybe have, and we'll talk about it in the next session, having, you know, those very concrete intervention steps at an early educational level where the brain, as Alain was telling us, is still in a critical period where something can actually be done. It's too late now to take perpetrators who are 70 years old and trying, you know, to prevent them from using Twitter or other, you know, areas. And actually, I will not give up, you know, on my, one of my goals was to ask you, how is the present era make the definition of group different? What are the risks here? And how is the propagation, you know, that viral thing can actually harm or help?
So just on the immune system analogy, I mean, one thing that I said in my paper, but I didn't mention in the talk yesterday, is that this groups need legitimacy for healthy reasons. And so extremism, you can see it as an autoimmune disorder where the immune system gets jacked up into overdrive and starts seeking justifications that aren't there. So I think, in terms of when we think about prevention, we do really have to be careful about not making things worse. In terms of the social environment, yeah, the concept of group is much different now. So the analogy I usually use when I talk about this is, if it was 1950 and you're a radical Druid and you live in Peoria, Illinois in the United States, you would go your whole life without ever meeting anybody who shared your views. Today, if you're that same person, you can get online and within an hour you can have a group of people who are going out and planting trees. So I think that, this is a profound change in how society organizes itself, and I think we're only beginning to understand it. It's very destabilizing. Social media favors extremism over mainstream. The previous media model of the previous generation, in which you had centralized media companies that controlled the large audiences, basically. So if you're an extremist, your options for getting your message out and for discovering other extremists and organizing were limited. You had to use shortwave radio. You had to have a rally that would be limited in a geographical area. You might get a public access cable channel, and then you could have an audience of 3,000 people in a limited geographic area. Now, social media rewards activity. So there are a couple of ways in which social media really structurally favors extremism. The first is that it circumvents all those safeguards. So there's no gatekeeper to stop the message from getting out to everybody. Second, it enhances discovery. So if you go on Twitter and you follow 5 people who are radical Druids, it will recommend 500 more radical Druids for you to follow. So discovery is no longer requires any kind of effort. Third is that you can interact with violent extremists and get comfortable with them and hear their ideas without putting yourself at personal risk. You don't have to go out and expose yourself to a dangerous person, so you can get comfortable with them before you adopt the ideology. So all of these things are radical changes in how people interact with each other. I mean, and when social media first came on the scene in the early 2000s, and everybody was talking about how it was going to change the world, I was skeptical about that. I thought this is just an extension of the kinds of communication technologies we had before. But I was wrong, and I have come to really see that social media by itself, as it exists now, is extremely destabilizing, and I don't think there's going to be an easy solution to that. I think it's going to take a couple of decades for us to figure out how to restore the strength of the center.